Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Now, when it comes to people who reject the moon landings, they cover quite a broad range of what they're prepared to accept. By that, I mean there are some people who think NASA landed on the moon in the 1960s, but just the footage that we see was faked here on Earth. Right the way along to flat earthers who say, sod the moon, you can't even go to space because you'll crash into the firmament. But probably the broadest part of that spectrum are people that say going to the moon in the 60s wasn't possible due to technological limitations with navigation or that film cameras couldn't survive in the radiation of space, but spacecraft now are capable of reaching the moon, like Artemis 1 that flew past the moon a few years ago, or landers like Blue Ghost or Chandrayaan 3 that recently landed on the moon. For example, just the other day, I had a person commenting on a recent video of mine claiming NASA never went to the moon in the 1960s because the computers weren't advanced enough, claiming they failed 17 tests but managed to nail the actual landing first time. Now, I pointed out that before Apollo 11 landed on the moon, not only did NASA land unmanned surveyor probes successfully, but the Soviets also landed an unmanned craft as well, Luna 9. Their response was that it was all faked here on Earth and that nothing ever went to the moon in the 60s, manned or unmanned. But when I asked them about modern missions, they said that nowadays, with modern technology, it is possible for spacecraft to reach the moon. And this video is really aimed more at people in that area of the argument. Those that say going to the moon in the 60s was not possible, but now it is. Because I think I've found a great piece of evidence to uproot those claims. And it's photos of this crater. This is the Tsiolkovsky crater. It's really quite a distinctive looking one. In fact, I even showed a stereoscopic 3D photo of this crater in a recent video that I'd made using photos taken from the Apollo missions. This was named after Russian scientist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who helped pioneer rocket science in the late 1800s and early 1900s. One of his most notable works was actually developing the ideal rocket equations used for calculating rocket performance. This crater was first captured by the Soviet Luna 3 probe in 1959, hence they named it after one of their own scientists. It was also photographed by the US Lunar Orbiter 1 in 1966, and then by most of the Apollo missions. Apollos 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 15, 16 and 17 were all able to get very highly detailed photographs of it with their medium format Hasselblads. It seems Apollo 14 was the only lunar mission that didn't actually photograph it. And they were also able to get photographs of it with Apollo 15 and 17's mapping cameras. More recently, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has captured it, and in 2023, it was photographed in great detail by South Korea's Daenury probe. I really hope that's how you pronounce that. And like I said, the Tsiolkovsky crater is quite distinctive looking, with its dark floor and then a bright mountain in the middle of it. And we can see the photos of it from all of the Apollo missions are a perfect match to the photos from the Daenury probe, which I'm going to say is pretty big evidence for the moon landings happening. Now, I know there's a lot of people who claim that the Apollo photographs that show them in lunar orbit were in fact faked by NASA, creating a large model of the moon and then just putting a camera near that. Now, NASA did indeed create large model replicas of regions of the moon's surface as part of helping the astronauts during simulator training to practice lunar approaches. But obviously, to many, that will just seem like a cover story. The question, though, is how did they get the reference material in the first place to create such accurate replicas? Now, I suspect some people, especially those that say you couldn't travel to the moon in the 60s, will say, well, you can photograph the moon from Earth just with large telescopes and then build a 3D model with those. And that's true. There is, however, one very big problem with that idea when it comes to this, because only about a dozen humans have ever actually laid eyes on the Tsiolkovsky crater, those being the Apollo astronauts, because the Tsiolkovsky crater is located on the backside of the moon. And because the moon is tidally locked, it means that that crater is completely hidden from view from Earth. The only way to view this crater is to place yourself beyond the moon. For example, in the rather well-known time-lapse from the Discover satellite of the moon passing by the Earth, you can see the Tsiolkovsky crater right there. Hence why it wasn't discovered until 1959, because Luna 3 was the first spacecraft to photograph the far side of the moon. So the problem now for these claims of not being able to travel to the moon in the 60s is how did they know about and get photographs of the Tsiolkovsky crater? This crater is unlike anything we see on the Earth-facing side of the moon. So creating such an accurate replica for photographs in the 60s that then perfectly match recent photographs from modern spacecraft either points to spacecraft in the 60s actually having the ability to reach the moon, which makes sense given that before humans had even orbited the moon, NASA had already launched 6 Pioneer probes far beyond the moon and into orbit around the sun, and the Soviets had launched at least 2 as well. And before the end of the Apollo program, NASA launched Pioneer 10 to fly by Jupiter. So if those were possible, then getting someone to the moon and taking photographs of the Tsiolkovsky crater, not that difficult. Or none of that ever happened, and it's just pure coincidence that the fake photographs of the crater from the 60s just happen to be a perfect match to the newer photos. Or it means even the newer photos of the backside of the moon from the likes of the Discover satellite and the Denari probe are also fake. I did look to see if Artemis 1 had captured any of it, but unfortunately I couldn't see it. Around the period that Orion was orbiting the moon in 2022, we were seeing a full moon here on Earth. So I suspect the Tsiolkovsky crater region was in shadow, and because Orion was in a fairly high orbit around the moon, its cameras were unlikely to adjust to expose the shaded areas. Or if it did get a view of it, it wasn't part of anything that was made public. Now, of course, some could say, okay, maybe unmanned spacecraft could get to the moon in the 60s, but humans still couldn't go. That would still allow them to know about the crater in order to model it for photographs. However, the issues that I'm seeing with that are the mapping probes which were sent to the moon in the 60s all carried black and white film for the best surface detail. However, many of the photographs from Apollo were taken on colour film, and you can see the variations in the surface colour of these photos, which again points to a few possibilities. Either the crater was actually photographed by the Apollo astronauts, or they just blind guessed what colours the crater should be, or the mapping probes were really carrying colour film, but NASA decided to convert everything to black and white before making it public to hide the true colours from people. Which that would be some incredible insight and forward planning, wouldn't it? Photograph the moon in colour, but only release the photos in black and white so that you can then later release Apollo photos of a crater on the backside of the moon in colour in order to make the moon landing seem more convincing. From the same NASA, who these hoaxers think somehow completely forgot about the existence of the Van Allen belts that NASA themselves discovered, or the same NASA who's seemingly never thought to put a blast crater underneath the lunar module. Though, one further thing to add about this crater, which to me points heavily to the moon landings being real, I found research papers that were published in 1988 by an A. Tyree from the University of Toronto about the Tsiolkovsky crater. One paper titled about the description of it, and one about age dating the crater. And the papers reference the Apollo astronauts' personal descriptions of witnessing the crater, and much of the age estimations were done using data from multiple Apollo missions, but also heavily relying on the Apollo 15 mapping photos. And they aged the crater at 3.51 billion years old. Seems strange that a university study would come to the conclusion that a crater is 3.5 billion years old if they were based off photographs of a model made here on Earth. Or that the best resolution photos they had of the crater, and that they chose to use, were the ones from Apollo 15, not the ones from the initial probes which would have been used as reference to build said model. Rather, instead, all of this points to early missions discovering the existence of the Tsiolkovsky crater, but actually it was the manned Apollo missions which were able to go and get the best photos of it for analysis, since nothing on Earth can even see it. But modern probes now have also been to see it and confirmed its appearance is accurate. In fact, there was even talk during Apollo of landing a mission at the Tsiolkovsky crater. Astronaut Harrison Schmitt, who was the lunar module pilot for Apollo 17, was also a trained geologist, and by that point it was known that Apollo 17 was going to be the last mission of the program, and he, along with many other scientists, were advocating that they should land at the Tsiolkovsky crater to thoroughly research it. The idea was ultimately rejected by NASA because landing on the backside of the moon would then require communication satellites be put into lunar orbit in order to allow Houston to remain in contact with the astronauts. So, like I said, I think this crater alone is very strong evidence that getting to the moon in the 60s was not only possible, but actually happened. But as always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this and you haven't already done so, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.